The world is still reeling from the after-effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The invasion has divided the world and made it bipolar, to say the least. But the Russian invasion might only be the tip of the iceberg of the problems the world will face in the coming days. There is another big threat to counter in the East Asian region, with China eyeing to accede to Taiwan. Will the Taiwan problem be the catalyst of the Third World War? If China is to be believed, World War III might not be too far away. The country has warned about World War III being triggered at any time. But what exactly is the trouble brewing in the South China Sea? Will Taiwan be the catalyst for the Third World War? Watch the video to know why the tension is brewing and if there is a countermeasure. Taiwan has been at the center of attraction for many stakeholders for a long time. Self-governing Taiwan, which is home to the Republic of China, which fought against the Communist Party when it first emerged, views itself as an independent state, but Beijing views it as a breakaway province. Tensions around the island are long-standing, but increased significantly in 2019 when President Xi Jinping committed himself to reunifying the islands, reserving the right to use force if necessary. And in an apparent show of power, China recently has sent dozens of warplanes into Taiwan's airspace, as the state-backed newspaper People's Daily said there is almost no room for maneuver, suggesting the possibility of a face-off. It even claimed that China was ready for an all-out war with the US, warning that Taiwan was playing with fire. Taiwan, a democracy that considers itself a sovereign state, urged China to halt its proactive actions. Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen has vowed to do whatever it takes to guard Taiwan against invasion and warned the world that without help from its allies, Chinese authoritarianism will replace its democracy. Taiwan hopes for peaceful coexistence with China, she said, but if its democracy and way of life are threatened, Taiwan will do whatever it takes to defend itself. China has flown near-daily missions into Taiwan's airspace since the start of the year, the island's government has said, though most comprise only one aircraft. But that changed dramatically at the weekend, with 38 planes flown into the Air Defense Identification Zone. 34 J-16 fighters were among the 52 Chinese planes flown into Taiwan's ADIZ. 12 nuclear-capable H-6 bombers also flew in the sortie, along with 2 Su-30 fighters and several other military aircraft. The planes flew in 2 separate sorties, the first of which comprised 25 aircraft and flew during the day, followed by 19 aircraft which flew at night. They were accompanying 12 H-6 nuclear-capable bombers, 2 Y-8 anti-submarine warfare aircraft, and 2 KJ-500 early warning and control planes. All flew a short distance into the ADIZ between Taiwan's mainland and the Taiwan-controlled Pratas Island. Taipei said it scrambled fighters, broadcast radio warnings, and activated missile defenses in response. A short time later, the Chinese aircraft turned back. One of the biggest allies of Taiwan, the United States, has said they had spoken to the Chinese President Xi Jinping about Taiwan, and they agreed to abide by the Taiwan Agreement as tensions continue to ratchet up between Taipei and Beijing. US President Joe Biden said he had spoken to President Xi Jinping about Taiwan and that he would abide by the agreement. Biden appeared to be referencing a 90-minute call he held with Xi on September 9th of 2021, their first talks in 7 months. However, it's not entirely clear what agreement has been reached. "I've spoken with Xi about Taiwan. We agree that we'll abide by the Taiwan Agreement," Biden said to reporters at the White House. In 2021, Joe Biden was also quoted as saying that he would be willing to go to war if China invaded, though aides later insisted he had misspoken. The denial may have been a nod to Washington's long-standing policy under which the US officially recognizes Beijing rather than Taipei, and the Taiwan Relations Act, which makes clear that the US decision to establish diplomatic ties with Beijing instead of Taiwan rests upon the expectation that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. While that act binds the United States to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself, Washington only acknowledges China's stance that the island belongs to it and that there is one China, and takes no position on Taiwan's sovereignty. Taiwan's foreign ministry said it had sought clarification from the United States about Biden's comments and was reassured that the US policy towards Taiwan had not changed. The US commitment to them was rock solid, and that the US will continue to help Taiwan maintain its defenses. Facing the Chinese government's military, diplomatic, and economic threats, Taiwan and the United States have always maintained close and smooth communication channels, it said, noting recent US comments of concern about China's activities. These developments come as British aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth, called Big Lizzie, was shown sailing in the Philippine Sea in a joint exercise with two US carriers, the USS Ronald Reagan and USS Carl Vinson, and Japan's helicopter destroyer JS Ice. The Armada, which also includes several warships from 6 different countries in total, trained together over the weekend in the region amid the rising tensions. The recent voyages through the Strait of Taiwan by the British and American navies, coupled with the new AUKUS Defense Pact, have infuriated Beijing and sparked more shows of strength in the South China Sea. President Xi Jinping has described the seizure of the self-governed democracy as inevitable, and Beijing has increased pressure on Tsai since she was elected in 2016 on a mandate of an independent Taiwan. In another chilling piece of propaganda on Monday, the Global Times ran a piece that asked whether Australia is willing to accompany Taiwan to become cannon fodder after its foreign minister reached out for help preparing his defenses. Australia has been on the receiving end of Chinese wrath over the last few weeks after it signed a new alliance with the UK and the US. As part of the deal, Washington and London agreed to share nuclear submarine technology with Canberra. Beijing is incensed by the move because it will dramatically shift the power balance in the South China Sea, where it fights for influence with the West over smaller countries like Taiwan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. In an article, Taiwan's president said, "They should remember that if Taiwan were to fall, the consequences would be catastrophic for regional peace and the democratic alliance system. It would signal that in today's global contest of values, authoritarianism has the upper hand over democracy." Tsai's government on Monday urged Beijing to stop irresponsible provocative actions after the warplanes breached Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ. Amid almost daily intrusions by the People's Liberation Army, our position on cross-strait relations remains constant. Taiwan will not bend to pressure, Tsai added. The ADIZ is not the same as Taiwan's territorial airspace, but includes a far greater area that overlaps with part of China's own Air Defense Identification Zone and even includes some of the mainlands. Taiwan's ADIZ is a zone in which it requires all foreign aircraft to identify themselves and state their intentions. It's different from the island's sovereign airspace, which extends over a smaller area 12 nautical miles from its coast. The Republic of China has long-standing ties with the US, which historically recognized it as the legitimate government of the whole of China. In response, the US has forged new alliances in the region to counterbalance Beijing's growing power, including the Quad Alliance between America, India, Japan, and Australia. India has territorial disputes and related problems with China's expansionist policies. The AUKUS Pact is the sternest warning yet for Beijing, arming a nearby rival Australia with nuclear submarine capabilities. Since AUKUS was announced, Chinese flights near Taiwan have increased significantly and taken on new significance, with the UK and Australia potentially dragged into any future fighting. Fighting around the island could also drag in the US, which has long maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity to Taiwan, refusing to say what it would do if the island was attacked. Taiwan is at the fault line between democratic rule of law and authoritarianism with Chinese characteristics. It is also the intersection point between two major powers, both subject to strong political pressures, but with unequal interests, influence, and capacity for military action. For many in the United States, Taiwan has symbolic importance as an offshore rebuke to China and an emblem of what a democratic China could look like. For others, Taiwan is a blunt instrument used to harass the Chinese Communist Party. But for Xi Jinping, Taiwan is a historical and political imperative. Putting Taiwan on a path to unification is key both to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and to Xi's continued grip on power. No other issue is as central to the CCP identity or its leader's political survival. Yet, Xi has suffered a series of embarrassing setbacks over the past year. Not only did Beijing's nemesis Tsai Ing-wen score a major victory in her re-election bid, but her success was fueled by her very public support for pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong and her public repudiation of Xi's suggestion of a one country, two systems arrangement for Taiwan. The election outcome may have contributed to Beijing's calculation that there was little to gain from continued restraint in Hong Kong. Taiwan's stunningly efficient handling of COVID-19 won its international accolades and a backlash against Beijing's policy of excluding Taiwan from international forums like the recent World Health Assembly. And then there is the series of very public gestures of support to Taiwan by the United States. While some of those actions, such as arms sales and transfers in the US by Taiwan's president, may be comparable to steps taken by previous administrations, other high-profile actions are not. Two major pieces of legislation supporting closer relations with Taiwan were enacted in the space of 2 years. Senior US officials participated virtually in Tsai's second inauguration event, and the announcement that Taiwan's preeminent chipmaker would build a $12 billion cutting-edge semiconductor fabrication plant in Arizona coincided with the announcement of a rule denying Huawei world access to essential chip-making equipment. Meanwhile, rumors abound that US officials are contemplating unprecedented steps, such as US Navy ship visits to Taiwan ports, or even the rotational deployment of US Marines. The imbalance between the US and Chinese interests in Taiwan invites miscalculation and disproportionate response. The painstakingly constructed framework of the One China policy may not survive if Taiwan is used as an instrument of pushback against China. How confident can we be in our ability to assess how close Beijing's leaders may already be to deciding to make good on their promise of unification through force if need be? And if each perceived transgression by the other side incentivizes Washington and Beijing to double down on support for or pressure on Taiwan, how long before a crisis erupts? The often uneasy equilibrium that has marked US-China relations for decades should not insure us to the risk that we may now be dangerously close to a tipping point where even a small action would serve as a catalyst that lets slip the horrors of war. The roar of the trade war or the COVID blame game should not deafen us to warnings from either side. The fact is that no situation is so bad that it can't be made worse. And while there is no reason that chronic problems between Washington and Beijing can't abruptly become acute, there is abundant reason to worry that the political and diplomatic safeguards against uncontrolled escalation are largely inoperative. There is a caution to both leaders in the adage, if you can't be good, be careful. Xi Jinping gave a speech marking the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. After walking party members through China's recent past and glorious future, Xi turned to Taiwan. Resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification is a historic mission and an unshakable commitment of the Communist Party of China, he said. We must take resolute action to utterly defeat any attempt toward Taiwan independence and work together to create a bright future for national rejuvenation. What precisely are Beijing's plans for Taiwan? In recent years, there have been aggressive naval drills, aerial incursions, and warnings that force would be used for reunification if necessary. But given the steep domestic and international costs of war, how likely is it that Beijing will attempt to force reunification militarily? The simplest answer to the question of whether China will wage war on Taiwan is, it depends. No particular scenario is inevitable. The military balance across the Taiwan Strait is changing and increasingly lopsided. Some maintain that Xi Jinping has set a timetable for reunification to make it part of his legacy. But in turbulent times and facing many other daunting challenges, the weighing of costs and benefits is more likely to be determinative. Beijing is well aware that any scenario involving the war on Taiwan will be dramatically costly, especially given the likelihood that global opinion will tag the mainland as the aggressor. Others point out that Beijing has increased its military and diplomatic pressure on Taiwan, but often mistakes these moves as part of a well-honed plan, as opposed to responses to specific triggering events or trends. Many claims that public sentiment in Taiwan has irrevocably shifted against the mainland, and the pressure on Hong Kong's civil liberties in the wake of anti-government protests there have soured many of Taiwan's youth on Beijing. Nevertheless, cross-strait business and trade continue apace, and Taiwan students still head to the mainland for school and work. Over time, opinions may change. Some believe that Taiwan voters are likely to drive their leaders to take increasingly pro-independent stance and that this has set a collision course with Beijing. Tsai Ing-wen, however, was re-elected by a healthy margin despite her cautious first-term stance on independence-related issues. Taiwan's democracy is raucous but ultimately pragmatic. If there is no inevitability to Beijing waging war on Taiwan, we need to look at the factors that might make such a move more likely. It's difficult at this point to discern the kind of infighting that might inspire such a dramatic nationalistic distraction, but with uncertainty hanging over Beijing's political transitions, it cannot be ruled out. A sudden move by Taiwan authorities away from the Republic of China constitution, away from historical understandings around a One China framework, or to directly declare independence would all certainly be cause for alarm and would likely generate a punishing response from Beijing. Washington also figures largely here. The line between de facto and de jure independence in the international system is a thin one that is generally being controlled by the United States. Beijing, while uncomfortable with this reality, has wagered that it could keep the US from recognizing Taiwan, leaving its ambiguous status to be addressed later. But China continually perceives the US moves toward recognition and is prone to react to them. US disclaimers only add fuel to the paranoia. This dynamic could easily lead to the scenario envisioned by the question, especially in the current climate of mutual hostility and suspicion. So ultimately, whether war is waged over Taiwan depends on developments and leadership in Taipei, Beijing, and Washington. Lastly, if the economic growth of China is not sustained sufficiently to achieve promised prosperity, then there is a greater likelihood Beijing will externalize its internal economic challenges to include consideration of the forcible reunification of Taiwan. To underscore a critical point, beyond the scope of Taiwan, the South China Sea, and all other points of friction highlighted as uniquely consequential, the competition in its most critical context centers on China's understanding that its hybrid form of communism cannot compete against or survive full contact with the free and open international community of democracies. If China cannot reconcile its ability or inability to modify the rules-based international order to set the conditions necessary for something other than a free and open economic and governance system to compete on the global stage, it will continue to turn to force and corrosion. And in the modern world, where even small tensions escalate fast enough thanks to the World Wide Web, China's foreign policy certainly has the flair of a full-scale worldwide war. The US and its allies might have not done enough on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but when it comes to China, the situation might be different altogether. So, while we pray for the tensions to de-escalate ASAP, we must be well aware of the possibility of World War III knocking on our doors. And with that, we've come to the end of today's video. If you liked this video, then press the like button and also tap share to share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more interesting information. See you in the next one.